As I said, yeah, my name's Tom, and I'm here to talk to you about making Messier games. And I suppose in particular, it's kind of about my journey into a type of game I've not made before, and some of the things I learned along the way that hopefully will be helpful to some other people out there. So who am I? Yeah, I'm Tom. I go by Amicable Animal. 4 days a week, I am a lecturer in game design, software engineering, and psychology of vision. And 1 day a week, and let's be honest, a few evenings and weekend days, I'm a developer. This is a picture of me, and I know there's a picture on the side, but if you've got a picture like this, then you use a picture like this whenever you have the opportunity. And that's me on the right, and that's my friend Stephen, who is an audio and sound designer for my game SOLAS 128. I go by Amicable Animal online, so if you want to come follow me, I'm currently on Twitter, Mastodon, and Blue Sky. If you're watching this on repeat in a couple of weeks' time, absolutely who knows what will exist at that point. But I normally go under this name on all of those. And it kind of started as a bit of a thing to hide behind because I was normally quite nervous putting stuff out there and talking. But I've now been under this name for so long, it's sort of re-merged back in with my daily personality. So, people refer to me by Tom or Animal or whatever, whichever works for you. So, yeah, I've been making games for kind of most of my life on and off. But I really started maybe 7, 8 years ago trying to make a bit of a go of it. And I started in 2018, I think, by releasing this game called Central Limit Theorem, which is this really simple little turret shooter where you're attacked by angry geometric shapes that leave ink behind them. And it's really simple. You can find it, but I really liked how it looked and how it played because all the ink that was left on the screen affected how the other enemies later on behaved. I then released the next year something called Hagem, which is sort of a weird inverse haunted Tetris. And both these two games came out of a game jam, the global game jam, in fact. And Hagem was where I met Stephen and Jamesy, who then became my audio designer and musician on SOLAS 128, which is probably the game that if you know me at all, you know me by, because the Thinky community was really kind to it and, gave really good feedback and was really, really generous about it. And if you've not played it, it's this kind of laser deflection game where instead of lasers, you have little pulses of light that move around to a synthwave beat. And it's a huge interconnected thing that was supposed to take 3 months and be a small project and ended up consuming my life for 2 years and became a whole thing. And I'm currently working on a game called CRT7, which is sort of a response to that and almost a little bit of a rebellion because of how SOLAS 128 took so much time and kind of burnt me out. And I wanted to make something really different. Now, as we'll come to in this talk, it's maybe not quite as different as I thought it was going to be as we went on. And really, this talk is going to be on my journey of first making something like SOLAS 128 and now making something like CRT7 and what I've kind of learned along the way. But before we really get going, I always like having a few caveats. I always think you should take everything, sorry to the organizers of ThinkyCon, but everything at cons like this with a massive pinch of salt, because everyone who speaks to you is saying their thoughts right now. But I can't guarantee these are going to be the same thoughts I have in 2 months' time. They're all bundled up with a bunch of survivorship bias and background and all this other historic stuff. One of the main things is that I'm in a situation where I can be probably weirder than some people making games because I've got a day job. The next game isn't going to make or break my little kind of one-person studio. So if you have more commercial pressures, then that's something you should bear in mind. And also, I'm going to give some suggestions, but if you want to ignore them and do something weird, do it, right? That's how you learn. That's how you come up with the more interesting, strange stuff that could take off. So, all that being said, because I'm a lecturer in my day job, I tend to structure things. So, I wanted to start with some context and some background for some of the terms that we're going to talk about and why I kind of think they're useful, at least for me. So, I tend to break down puzzle games into two really broad, slightly nebulous categories, but I tend to think of them as being these possibility space puzzle games or these Messier puzzle games. And possibility space puzzle games are things like Sokoban Express, Liquidum, Solas, or Lock. And I think of these as games where you have like a core mechanic, whether it be drawing a line, solving a pericross, redirecting lasers, and then you build on them, right? And you have this subset of mechanics that tend to be relatively small. And what you're doing as a designer is you're exploring the possibility space this gives you to find all the interesting corners and places where puzzles might live. And what's really important here is you tend to like have mechanics and then build on them. So in Liquidum, for example, which I love, you have kind of you're solving a Picross, but then they layer on, well, you also have water and you need to deal with the way water might flow. And then they layer on angled pieces which affect how the water flow, and then they layer on boats. And I think that's a really interesting type of puzzle game and one I love making and love playing. But I think there's another type of puzzle game as well that's really interesting, which is the messy types. So I had a real problem when I was making SOLAS. I really wanted to make this possibility space puzzle game. And I know Joe in particular will be having flashbacks seeing this sequence here, because this is a part of the game that ended up really, really late on in the game. And what's going on here is every single one of these screens you're seeing is linked. And when you first enter this area, you can only solve the first screen. And each time you solve the screen, you'll unlock another screen and you have to resolve everything beforehand. So in this case here, you had to first off get things into the blue. And then once that unlocked, you could go to the next screen. You had to get stuff into the yellow receiver. But then you had to reconfigure all the screens you'd been to before. And this was in the game because I was like, this is really cool. This is a really interesting corner of the possibility space that exists in SOLAS because of the mechanics I've built into it. But it's really hard, like way too hard. And originally it was quite early on in the game comparatively. And Joe and a few other of my pilot testers were saying, like it's too hard. You have to move this. But because as a designer, I thought it was so cool with the possibility space, I didn't want to lose it. And I eventually compromised by putting it right at the end of the game, like deep, deep in some secrets. And even now, the people who managed to get there still tell me, look, it's really hard. It's too hard. It's such a difficulty spike. But I got trapped into this kind of mindset of, well, it's part of the possibility space, so I want it in my game. And that's part of the reason the game got so big in the end, is because I kept wanting to explore these things. So I then moved on to making what I call these a more messy puzzle game. And when I say messy puzzle games, what I mean is really stuff like escape rooms or kind of the Myst and Myst likes. Games where you have a puzzle and you tell people what the puzzle is, they solve the puzzle, and then they move on. You don't have this constant loop of building up mechanics on top of each other. It's more you have this cool, interesting thing you fiddle with, you solve it, then you move on to a different cool, interesting thing you fiddle with. That's not to say there can't be linkages or summative puzzles or boss puzzles, but it kind of has a different cadence to those more possibility space puzzle games. And I wanted to make one of these because I love the Myst games, I love escape rooms, and I thought it would be really different to SOLAS. And it's really important to say here, when I use the term messy, I'm not using it as like a pejorative term at all. I think messy puzzle games are really cool and interesting and weird and can be really fun. And in fact, when I think of messy puzzle games, what I really think of is the Super Mario games, because they have really made a history of doing these messy, interesting kind of designs, with Mario Bros. Wonder being the most recent one, where you have these like minute or 2 minute, just weird little new mechanics that get introduced, played with, and then thrown away. And the entire game's built around this kind of messy, like introducing and throwing away mechanics. And they've been doing this for a while. With Odyssey, you had the Cappy, which you could throw, and it often completely changed how you interact with the game. In Galaxy, you had gravity. But yeah, in Wonder, sometimes you're on top of some bulls, sometimes your pipes go all weird and snaky, you get loads of missiles, or you become a weird, long Mario for some reason. And I think this is really, really cool. So when I talk about messy games, what I really mean is it's about playing with lots of different ideas in the same game, picking them up, throwing them away, and kind of constantly moving forwards with them. And I'm not here to say one style of game is better than another. I think they're both cool. I play both types loads, but they do have their own pros and cons. And I really foolishly thought, oh, making possibility space puzzle games is really, really hard. I'm going to make this kind of more messy escape room game. That's going to be really easy. Oh, I was very, very wrong on that. Which takes us to part two, or part B, which is messy puzzle games have a really specific issue that I think is important to talk about and think about. And that is, it's really hard to tell what's actually part of the puzzle. Because often these more messy puzzle games, they potentially have more narrative, or they have kind of more world building and bigger kind of actual physical play spaces. It can become really difficult to tell what's part of the puzzle for the player. And our job then becomes, as the developer, how do we communicate that? So this example from an escape simulator, right? There's some stuff in here that's probably relatively obviously part of the puzzle. There's some buttons. There's some tiles on the back wall with kind of Egyptian gods and animals on and hieroglyphs that maybe look important. But there's some stuff where it's not clear it's part of the puzzle. Are the banners in the back corners part of the puzzle? Are the vases? Is the storm lantern? And this is not just for digital puzzle games. I've talked to real life escape room designers who've said they've had players like rip ceiling tiles off or unscrew radiators from the wall because they didn't fundamentally know what was puzzle, what was just standard room and set dressing. So it's a really important problem for us to solve, and one that wasn't obvious to me until I started making it. And there's been some potential proposed solutions to this, the potentially most classic one being the witness. And I'm not going to spoil anything in the witness, and I'm going to massively oversimplify it here, but what the witness did is it went, right, instead of having like in a normal Myst game, you'd have buttons and levers and screens and all this different stuff, we're just going to have these puzzle panels. So the player will know you go up to puzzle panel, you interact with it, and that's how you interact with the game, right? And that's one way to solve this problem. And the reason I'm bringing it up here is because it is a way of effectively teaching players what's called an affordance. And I think that's a really important thing and a really important term to know if you're going to design any game, but especially puzzle games. So they use these panels as an affordance. And affordances, or I'm told more accurately, perceived affordances, are something that we've studied and looked at for a very long time in psychology of vision and design. And I like this definition. An affordance, to put it simply, is the quality of an object that communicates a way to use it. In other words, we know how to use the thing because it's obvious how to use the thing, or because we've previously learned how that thing works. So, a really classic example of this you see a lot talked about and often got wrong in real life is doors, right? If you have a big handle on a door, you normally will instinctually grab it and try and pull it. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because you have this handle, it's something you can get your hand around, and it kind of makes sense to pull it towards you. Alternatively, sometimes you have plates on these doors, and now because there's nothing to grab onto, you can't pull it towards you. It's almost impossible to. So your natural reaction is to push it away. So if you've ever walked into a door while you're trying to leave a building, it's often because someone's put a handle on a push door, and you're so used to how they work, and it makes so much more sense for it to be a pull thing that you just get it wrong and slam into it. And what's important here is you can put as many labels on this as you like, and people will still ignore it. And you'll be able to find loads of talks about people getting annoyed about doors because of this. But I also think just a door itself is a really interesting affordance. If you put a mysterious door in your game or in real life, you want to go through it. My brain is looking at this door right now going, I want to go through that door. And I think that's doubly true if you put like staff only or restricted access or authorized personnel only. Every part of my brain then wants to go through that door because you've learned that there's stuff on other side of doors. You know how they work. There's a room in there. There might be something cool. Now, almost always it's a staff break room with people shouting at you about why you're in their staff break room. But there might be that one time when it's not, when there's something really cool. So these doors have become these really interesting affordances, and they have real life important like considerations. These pedestrian crossings that you'll recognize if you're in the UK, I think are really well designed. They've got an obvious button you press, a light turns on to tell you you've pressed the button, and then you have the kind of red crossing person, the green crossing person. The red one has their arms down by their side, clearly not moving, and the green one is striding confidently. And they all work to tell you how these things should be reacted to without you having to read. And I can tell you, if a light bulb goes out in one of these, people just do not know how to use them anymore. They're constantly mashing the button. And when I went to America and they had, frankly, worse design ones of these, I really didn't know how to work them because they weren't as good with their affordances. What I think is really interesting about affordances is we can learn them. So the panels in the witness are kind of a learned affordance, but this is a really good example of a learned affordance as well. Now, unless you're like me and a complete retro nerd, if you're under the age of 30, you won't have saved to a floppy disk in your entire life. You've probably never seen a floppy disk. They come from the era when you had a computer like this with two disk drives, and one disk held your application, the other disk was your hard drive because you didn't have a hard drive. So the icon was literally put the data on this disk, right? But the fact is, nobody's used one of these computers for a very long time, and yet this icon still appears everywhere. So this was in PowerPoint, Snip, and LibreOffice. And what's happened is that we've got this whole generation of people who know this is the save button, and they know what it does, but they've never used the iconography it's based off. So it's this really interesting learned affordance. And affordances can trip you up no matter how much you know about them. When I first worked on this phone interface that I had in SOLAS, I had this message thing that you could click on and read some messages, and it didn't scroll. And the first thing everybody did when they played it was try and scroll it. And of course they did. Almost everyone owns a phone with a text messaging app. And the first thing you do when you see messages is you try and scroll them. But I didn't think about it. So I had this kind of negative, what's called a negative affordance that annoyed people because they knew how the thing should work and it didn't work that way. So I had to go in and spend a few days just making it work how people expected. And that's to say, like, even if you know about this stuff, it's still really easy to miss them. This is the thing with the witness, right? They teach you this affordance, but it's built not just in the game, but most people have drawn these mazes before, drawn lines to solve mazes before. So they kind of have these learned affordances they've built the game around. But there's still one big problem. Even if you know how to use a thing, you have to still direct people's attention to the thing. And that goes into the second kind of big term I've really used a lot, and that's called preattentive features. And if your eyes were drawn to something on this slide, well, you're not alone, because that's a really common preattentive feature. And the definition that I found is that a preattentive feature is a feature that guides attention to visual search. And that's a very academic way of saying it's a way of drawing people's attention to something. Now, we don't have time to go into all of like how our visual system works, but put really simply, when we see a scene, we have two images of it, and our brain has to do a lot of processing to figure out what's in that scene. It has to figure out what is connected together, what are different items in it, like that's a monitor, that's a door, that's a person, that's a face. Are they smiling? Are they grumpy? Are they bored? And that takes relatively long amount of time. So, we can only react to things after, 20, 30 milliseconds, up to half a second sometimes. And that's fine in most instances. But if there's a bus coming towards you, evolutionarily, we want a way of dealing with that really quickly. So when you've processed the scene and you've understood what's in it, that's called attending to the scene. And therefore, we have these pre-attentive features, which are things that bypass all that processing, and your brain just goes, look at the thing, it's going to hit you, look at the thing. And that means these are really, really powerful things because, to put it simpler, you can't help but notice certain things. Your eyes will be drawn to them, and all the experiments we've done on eye tracking shows this. One of the most classic things where eyes are immediately drawn to instantly is just the human shape or a face. We will look at them by default. Although I would say don't look at the research about where you look on a person by default, because it really doesn't make our species look good generally. So if you were to put this in front of someone and you track their eyes, normally people would scan across it, sometimes randomly, sometimes in a really ordered process, but there wouldn't be any kind of like consensus. But the second you use something like this, everyone's eyes goes to the flashing thing. And it makes sense, right? It makes sense that we're trained to see things moving and flashing because that's potentially danger. And that's why all of our hardware likes flashing lights at us because they know it works to attract attention. That's why you might have your notification light or an error light on a bit of hardware. But there's some other really fun ones like orientation, where you can have just one line in a different direction to everything else. And all eye tracking will say that people look at that first. So really, all pre-attentive features come down to are making something kind of obviously different. There's loads of different known pre-attentive features out there. There's like color or luminance, size and length, orientation. Curvature is interesting. If you have a lot of square stuff versus a lot of rounded or curved stuff, you'll look at whichever one is rarer. And enclosure, which is a really obvious one, but it's just if you draw a box around something, people will look at the thing you've drawn a box around first. But what's interesting about this is how powerful they are. And if you look at a game like Control, which I think uses these techniques amazingly well, this picture from the DLC, right? They've used luminance, they've used human forms, they've used combinations of curvature and straight, they've enclosed the door. But without the game having to tell you, look at the door, everything in this scene is composed to tell you, look at the door. And it's really, really powerful, especially when you're navigating some of the weird and kind of impossible spaces in Control. And they do this in the ashtray maze, which is this weird reconfiguring space, really strongly, because I suspect they had people getting lost really quite commonly because there's loads of doors. So they just open doors and were like, look at this massive beam of light, go to the massive beam of light, you moth. And I've tried to use this in CRT7 as well. And this is kind of based on the classic kind of a poltergeist thing where you have the glowing TV in the distance. I think it's a really powerful image. And I've tried to use enclosure with the door to kind of draw your eye to say, like, go into the room, something important's in there. There's a whole bunch of research about this as well around stuff called Gestalt laws, which are how we tell what is a thing and what's related to each other, which I don't have time to go into, but I really recommend you check out the Laws of UX website. It's got some really useful stuff about kind of proximity, similarity, and connectedness and how powerful that all is. So that brings us back to kind of the main point is I started out on this journey of making this new game thinking this is a very different type of game. It'll be really easy to make. And that was partly because when you make any puzzle game, it's really hard, especially the possibility space ones, because you introduce a mechanic, you have to teach it, you add something new, and you get this loop. But what I've come to realize is that the more messy puzzle games are even harder in some ways because you're doing this loop, but loads from start over and over and over again, sometimes in parallel, sometimes in series, sometimes overlapping. And I actually now think most puzzle designers should at some time go and make like an escape room, go design a messy puzzle game because you learn so much because you're doing this loop so often that now I look back at SOLAS and I'm still proud of it, but there's so many bits in there that I've now realized I could communicate better by using preattentive features better or affordances better. So I really recommend everyone goes and tries this. But if there's one thing you take away, it's to kind of think about this loop, which is use preattentive features to draw people's attention, then affordances to use to tell people how to use the thing, and then make sure you react some way to the user input and keep using that loop to direct people around your game. So just to wrap up, if you want to try the game that I've mentioned, CRT7 has a demo on Steam at the moment. Obviously, please go and wishlist it and all that. It's really super helpful, especially if you're for developers like myself who are working by myself or in really small teams. You can see how I've used it. You can criticize how I've used it and all that. But yeah, please go and try and wishlist it. It'll be really appreciated. And also, because I can't help myself, I have maybe snuck a puzzle into the slides if you wish to go and try and solve that. And feel free to tweet me the answer if you figure it out. I did do it rather last minute, so it's probably too hard because my first puzzle drafts are always too hard. But, you know, if you're rewatching this, have fun with that, see what you can see. And yeah, thanks so much for listening. And Joe, I think I'm on time, maybe?
You are absolutely on time. Perfect. Thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. And I did indeed get flashbacks to that puzzle in SOLAS.
You were very, very right about that. So you have that on record, on video.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad it was moved to where it was moved. We did have some questions in the chat. In fact, one of the questions was, wait, is there a puzzle hidden in this presentation?
Ooh, so someone was paying attention, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you answered that. I didn't even notice it as it was coming past, but Foxbot was happened to notice it. Nice one. Then we've just had a question from Kyle there saying, something I often struggle with in escape rooms or messy puzzle games is where do I start? How much would you suggest helping the player with starting points?
Oh, yeah, massively. That you're right. That is one of the most difficult things. And one of the things in CRT7 is I've used like a really limited kind of low poly style, partly because when you're doing it by yourself, you don't have time to do a lot of 3D work, but also it's to deal with that problem. So the way CRT7 works is as you play, you turn on lights around the room that unlocks new tables. And that's specifically because otherwise, where do people start? You need kind of like a really obvious first, just go and press this button or go and interact with this thing first, or people get really, really lost. And I think most really successful games of that type tend to kind of bound you in a small area first before they let you out, because otherwise, yeah, you can get lost really easily, because especially if it's a game you can wander around wherever, people just by default will wander in entirely the wrong direction or do the weirdest things. So in CRT7, you had pentominoes, you could stamp on a board and rotate, and I had to make an entire game mode just to tell people they could rotate them because they just didn't realize to start with, because people don't read. So anything you can do to help players is good. And no matter how much you've done, people will still probably do it wrong at some point.
And having played some of it, it does indeed do that where you like, at the beginning, you're like focused on one particular part of the room and it gradually opens up the room. So that works very effectively. Next question from Plushla. Since noise can be used for good in puzzles, do you think the ambiguity in messy puzzle games can be useful? Also, do you think that Tunic and Outer Wilds count as messy puzzle games?
Oh, we don't have time for me to answer questions about Tunic. I personally had a lot of issues with Tunic, but not from the puzzle design. I thought most of the puzzles were done quite well. I think the Outer Wilds is probably, I always think of that being like a modern Myst, like, and being kind of a messy puzzle game. But that kind of deals with the starting point in a different way by just saying you can literally start anywhere and they kind of join back together. But that's a really hard design, I think, especially if you're starting out. As to the noise question, I think noise can be interesting, but you have to be careful because if there's too many red herrings and there's too much stuff that doesn't do anything, I think it really frustrates players. And that comes under the negative affordance thing. If they're constantly looking in bits, they don't do anything, then they're going to get bored. And the way Escape Simulator kind of deals with it is just its spaces are really small. So actually, if you have to brute force search the whole thing, it doesn't take that long. But that doesn't really scale very well to bigger games. Because Joe and I have played some of the bigger puzzle rooms on then, and when the puzzle rooms get bigger, it actually gets really annoying. So yeah, I think noise is good, but you have to be careful. And if you can use that noise and they link into something later, I think that's really cool because people go, oh, that thing that didn't do anything, it does something now. And I think people like that kind of revelation.
Thank you for that answer. We'll do one more from Gal Green in the comments. So do you consider, okay, so another, do you consider this game a messy game? Do you consider The Witness a messy game?
So we have had I've debated this with a friend, and no, I think it looks like a Myst-like, but actually plays much more like a possibility space puzzle game, generally. Ignoring some of the stuff it does later that we shouldn't get into for spoiler reasons. Generally speaking, it's actually quite a bounded game of you're learning very specific rules that build on each other. Where something you're never kind of going to Myst and like moving a bridge or like redirecting water flow so much or doing that stuff as much. So they are kind of slightly nebulous categories, and stuff definitely cross cuts over them. It's just something I use kind of to think, to really help my thinking with them, I suppose. But yes, in answer to your question, I guess not really, but it looks like one, but doesn't play like one. It feels like a cop-out.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think I agree. Paul Pocky had a last question, which is what are your top 100 messy puzzle games? But I don't think there's time for that. So,
it's all of the Myst games you've not played, Joe. All of them.
Oh, okay.
Especially
rubbing in that I've not played them. Stop telling people. Alrighty, folks. Yeah, thank you once again, Tom, for joining. Lots of people saying thank you for the talk in the chat as well.
Thank you.
We'll go set up for the next talk. See you in a minute.